In 1980, a Detroit police raid on a suspected drug operation netted more than anyone expected. Within hours, $4.2 million in cash had vanished without explanation. No paperwork, no evidence logs, no questions asked. The money simply disappeared into the shadows of a corrupt system that had learned to look the other way. For nearly 3 decades, the case remained buried under layers of bureaucracy and silence. But in 2009, during the routine clearing of a deceased officer's basement storage locker, a sealed metal box surfaced that would crack open one of Detroit's most carefully guarded secrets. On the morning of September 18, 1980, the Detroit Police Department's Narcotics Division prepared for what should have been a standard high-value bust. The target was a warehouse complex on the city's east side, suspected of housing a major cocaine distribution network. Intelligence reports suggested significant cash holdings, but no one anticipated the scale of what they would uncover. The operation involved 12 officers, 2 sergeants, and a lieutenant. What happened in the following 6 hours would expose a web of corruption that reached deep into the department's command structure. The warehouse sat in an industrial zone that had seen better days. Abandoned factories and empty lots surrounded the target building, providing perfect cover for illicit activity. At 6:30 a.m., unmarked vehicles positioned themselves at strategic points around the perimeter. The plan was methodical, designed to prevent any escape routes and ensure complete containment of the scene. Radio chatter was minimal. Communications were encrypted, and every officer understood their role in what was expected to be a textbook narcotics operation. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At exactly 7:15 a.m., the raid commenced. Officers breached the main entrance using a battering ram, while simultaneous entry teams secured the rear and side exits. The warehouse interior was larger than anticipated, with multiple rooms, storage areas, and what appeared to be sophisticated packaging equipment. Within minutes, the building was secured. 3 suspects were detained without incident, their hands zip-tied and faces pressed against concrete floors stained with decades of industrial use. But it was the discovery in the central storage room that changed everything. Stacked against the far wall were dozens of cardboard boxes, each sealed with industrial tape and bearing no identifying marks. The first box officers opened contained bundled cash, neatly organized in denominations of 20s, 50s, and 100s. The second box held the same, and the third. As the count progressed, it became clear they had stumbled upon something far beyond a typical street-level operation. The money was pristine, organized with bank-quality precision, and accompanied by ledgers written in a coded system that suggested sophisticated record-keeping. This wasn't the chaotic cash pile of small-time dealers. It was the systematic accumulation of a large-scale enterprise, one that had clearly been operating for an extended period without detection. The total count reached $4.2 million, a staggering sum that dwarfed any previous narcotic seizure in the city's history. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the commanding officer on scene, immediately recognized the magnitude of the situation. This amount of cash would require extensive documentation, federal notification, and coordination with multiple agencies. Standard protocol demanded that every bill be counted, photographed, and entered into evidence under strict chain of custody procedures. The warehouse would need to be processed by forensics teams, and the suspects would require interrogation by specialized detectives trained in financial crimes. Yet something felt wrong from the moment the money was discovered. Webb noticed subtle changes in the behavior of several officers under his command. Hushed conversations took place in corners of the warehouse, away from the main activity. Radio communications became sporadic, and routine check-ins with dispatch were delayed or abbreviated. The atmosphere, which should have been celebratory given the size of the bust, carried an undercurrent of tension that Webb couldn't immediately identify. The process of cataloging the evidence began according to standard procedures. Officers worked in pairs, counting and recording each bundle while supervisors maintained oversight. But as the afternoon wore on, discrepancies began to emerge. Initial counts varied between teams, and reconciliation efforts produced inconsistent totals. What should have been a straightforward documentation process became increasingly complex and time-consuming. By evening, the warehouse had been cleared and secured, the suspects transported to holding facilities, and the evidence loaded into department vehicles for transport to the Central Evidence Facility. The official report, filed later that night, documented the seizure of narcotics, drug processing equipment, and $4.2 million in cash. The paperwork appeared complete, the chain of custody seemed intact, and the case was classified as a major victory for the department's ongoing war against drug trafficking. But within 48 hours, questions began to surface. The federal agencies that should have been automatically notified of such a significant cash seizure had received no communication from Detroit PD. The suspects, when processed through the system, claimed the money figure was substantially higher than what had been officially reported. Their attorneys, while acknowledging their clients' involvement in illegal activity, disputed the documented amount of seized cash and demanded a full accounting. Internal audits revealed troubling gaps in the documentation. Timestamps on evidence bags were inconsistent, witness signatures were missing from crucial forms, and the photographic record of the money showed clear signs of having been taken in multiple sessions rather than during a single evidence processing event. Most concerning was the discovery that several officers present during the raid had failed to submit required incident reports, claiming they had been instructed to defer their documentation to senior personnel. Detective Sarah Coleman, assigned to the department's Internal Affairs Division, began a quiet investigation into the discrepancies. Her initial review of the case file revealed procedural violations that went beyond simple oversight or administrative error. The pattern suggested deliberate manipulation of evidence documentation, coordinated among multiple officers, and executed with enough sophistication to avoid immediate detection. Coleman's investigation faced immediate obstacles. Officers who had participated in the raid became uncooperative when questioned about specific details. Memories that should have been sharp regarding such a significant operation became suddenly vague and unreliable. Requests for additional documentation were met with claims that certain records had been misfiled or were temporarily unavailable due to ongoing federal coordination that couldn't be verified. The warehouse itself, when revisited weeks later, had been thoroughly cleaned and showed no trace of the sophisticated operation that had allegedly been discovered there. The building's ownership records revealed a complex web of shell companies and offshore entities that made identifying the actual proprietors nearly impossible. Even the suspects who had been arrested seemed to vanish into the system, their cases delayed by procedural complications and jurisdictional disputes. As Coleman dug deeper, she uncovered a troubling pattern of similar cases throughout the department's recent history. High-value drug raids that resulted in substantial cash seizures, followed by administrative complications and evidence discrepancies that were quietly resolved without public scrutiny. The September warehouse raid wasn't an isolated incident, but appeared to be part of a systematic approach to skimming proceeds from major narcotics operations. The investigation stalled when Coleman was reassigned to a different division, following what her supervisors described as a necessary reorganization of internal affairs resources. Her case files were archived, her access to certain records was restricted, and her replacement was instructed to focus on more pressing matters involving officer misconduct complaints from the public. The $4.2 million, according to official records, had been properly processed and secured in the department's evidence facility. But when federal auditors eventually gained access to conduct their own review, They discovered that the physical evidence consisted primarily of photocopied currency samples and detailed documentation claiming the actual cash had been transferred to federal custody for ongoing investigation. The federal agencies named in the transfer documents had no record of receiving any such evidence. The truth about what happened to the $4.2 million remained locked away, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic misdirection and calculated silence. The case file was eventually sealed, classified as an ongoing federal investigation that couldn't be discussed publicly. Officers who had been present during the raid either transferred to other departments, retired early, or simply refused to discuss the matter when approached by reporters or investigators. For Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the aftermath of the warehouse raid marked the beginning of a slow descent into paranoia and isolation. He had witnessed something that violated every principle he believed the badge represented, yet speaking out would have meant career suicide and possibly worse. Webb began keeping detailed personal records of department activities, storing documents and photographs in a private location away from official channels. The 3 suspects arrested during the raid were eventually released on technicalities related to evidence handling procedures. Their attorneys argued successfully that the inconsistencies in documentation created reasonable doubt about the legitimacy of the entire operation. Without reliable evidence and with key witnesses becoming uncooperative, prosecutors had no choice but to drop the charges. The men disappeared back into Detroit's underground economy, their brief encounter with law enforcement serving as a cautionary tale about the risks of operating too visibly. Detective Sarah Coleman's forced reassignment sent a clear message throughout the department. Asking too many questions about certain cases was a career-limiting move. Officers learned to focus on their immediate responsibilities and avoid investigating irregularities that might implicate their colleagues or superiors. The blue wall of silence, already strong within Detroit PD, became virtually impenetrable when it came to matters involving large-scale evidence discrepancies. Years passed, and the warehouse raid faded from active memory. New scandals emerged, different cases captured public attention, and the missing millions became just another unsolved mystery in a city that had grown accustomed to corruption and institutional failure. The officers involved continued their careers, some advancing to positions of greater authority within the department. But Webb couldn't let it go. The weight of what he had witnessed ate at him daily. He began documenting everything he observed, creating a detailed record of suspicious activities within the narcotics division. His notes included names, dates, locations, and descriptions of operations that seemed to follow the same pattern as the warehouse raid. Money would be seized, documented inconsistently, and then disappear into administrative limbo. In 1985, Webb made the decision to approach federal authorities directly. He contacted an FBI field office in neighboring Ohio, hoping to avoid the compromised channels within Detroit's law enforcement community. The meeting took place in a roadside diner outside Toledo, where Webb presented a federal agent with copies of documents he had been secretly maintaining for 5 years. The FBI agent, Special Agent Patricia Reeves, was initially skeptical. Allegations of police corruption were common, and many came from disgruntled officers seeking revenge against former colleagues. But Webb's documentation was extensive and detailed, providing specific information that could be independently verified. Reeves agreed to open a preliminary investigation, though she cautioned Webb about the dangers of his position. Within weeks of his meeting with federal authorities, Webb noticed changes in his work environment. He was excluded from major operations, reassigned to routine patrol duties, and subjected to increased scrutiny from supervisors. His requests for vacation time were denied. His equipment requisitions were delayed, and his performance evaluations began reflecting concerns about his attitude and reliability. The pressure intensified when Webb discovered that his personal vehicle had been tampered with. Brake lines showed signs of interference, and his home security system had been mysteriously disabled on multiple occasions. The message was clear. His cooperation with federal investigators had been detected, and retaliation was underway. Fearing for his safety and that of his family, Webb made arrangements to transfer his accumulated evidence to a secure location. He rented a storage locker under a false name in a facility across town, using cash payments and forged documentation to maintain anonymity. The locker became his insurance policy, containing copies of everything he had gathered over the years, along with detailed instructions for their use in case something happened to him. The federal investigation proceeded slowly and cautiously. Agent Reeves understood that moving too quickly would alert the targets and potentially compromise Webb's safety. Surveillance was established on key figures within the narcotics division, financial records were quietly subpoenaed, and connections between suspicious cases were carefully mapped. But the investigation faced significant obstacles. Many of the records Webb had referenced were no longer available through official channels, having been destroyed during routine file purging or lost due to administrative reorganization. Witnesses were reluctant to cooperate, and attempts to corroborate Webb's allegations through independent sources proved frustratingly difficult. In 1987, Webb suffered what appeared to be a heart attack while off duty. He was found unconscious in his apartment by a neighbor and rushed to Detroit General Hospital. Despite the efforts of emergency room physicians, he was pronounced dead at the age of 43. The autopsy revealed severe cardiac trauma consistent with a massive coronary event, though toxicology tests were inconclusive due to the advanced state of decomposition when certain samples were processed. Webb's death effectively ended the federal investigation. Without their primary source and with most documentary evidence either missing or unverifiable, Agent Reeves had insufficient grounds to proceed. The case was officially suspended, though Reeves maintained a personal file and continued monitoring developments within Detroit PD for several more years before being reassigned to other priorities. The storage locker Webb had rented remained untouched for over 2 decades. Monthly payments were automatically deducted from a checking account he had established specifically for that purpose, with sufficient funds to maintain the rental for years. The facility management had no reason to question the arrangement, and the locker became just another forgotten space in a building full of abandoned belongings. As Detroit's economic decline accelerated through the 1990s and 2000s, many of the officers involved in the warehouse raid either retired or moved to other jurisdictions. The institutional memory of the case faded, replaced by new crises and fresh scandals. The missing $4.2 million became a footnote in the city's long history of corruption and mismanagement. But in 2009, a routine administrative action would finally bring the truth to light. The storage facility where Webb had hidden his evidence was facing foreclosure due to declining occupancy rates and deferred maintenance costs. Unclaimed lockers were being cleared out systematically, their contents either auctioned off or disposed of, depending on their apparent value. When workers opened Webb's locker, they found a sealed metal box containing documents, photographs, and recordings that told the complete story of the warehouse raid and its aftermath. The discovery would ultimately expose a conspiracy that had remained hidden for nearly 3 decades, implicating officers who had risen to positions of significant authority within law enforcement. The metal box sat unopened for 3 days in the storage facility's administrative office. Workers had initially assumed it contained typical personal effects, perhaps old photographs or family documents. But the weight suggested something more substantial, and the elaborate sealing indicated deliberate preservation. The facility manager, facing mounting pressure to clear abandoned units quickly, decided to examine the contents before making a disposal decision. Inside were dozens of manila folders, each meticulously labeled with dates, case numbers, and officer names. Photocopied documents bore official Detroit Police Department letterheads, evidence tags, and witness statements. But it was the handwritten notes that immediately caught attention. Page after page of detailed observations, recorded in neat block letters, documenting discrepancies, unexplained delays, and suspicious behavior patterns within the narcotics division. The facility manager recognized the significance of what he had discovered. These weren't personal mementos or family records. They were official police documents that appeared to detail serious misconduct allegations. Rather than disposing of the materials, he contacted the Detroit Police Department's administrative offices to report the find and arrange for proper handling of what might be sensitive law enforcement materials. The call was routed through several departments before reaching Detective Captain Angela Morrison in Internal Affairs. Morrison had been with the department for 15 years and was familiar with most major corruption investigations from the previous decade. But the name Marcus Webb meant nothing to her initially. A record search revealed that Webb had been a lieutenant in narcotics who died of a heart attack in 1987, with no disciplinary actions or internal investigations in his personnel file. Morrison arranged to collect the box personally, rather than sending junior personnel. The drive to the storage facility gave her time to consider the implications. If the documents were authentic, they potentially represented evidence in cases that had been closed for decades. If they were fabricated, they could still cause significant damage to the department's reputation and morale. Either way, careful handling would be essential. The first document Morrison examined was a detailed floor plan of the warehouse raided in September 1980. Webb's handwritten notes in the margins identified specific locations where money had been stacked, along with precise counts and observations about the packaging. The level of detail suggested someone who had been present during the operation and had taken extensive notes immediately afterward. A photograph tucked between the pages showed stacks of currency arranged on a concrete floor. The image quality was poor, typical of 1980s instant cameras, but the denominations were clearly visible. Webb had written on the back in red ink, "Before official count, Room C, 1340 hours." The timestamp predated the official evidence processing by several hours, suggesting the money had been present in larger quantities before formal documentation began. Morrison spent the next several hours reviewing the contents systematically. Webb had maintained what amounted to a parallel investigation file, complete with surveillance notes, financial calculations, and character assessments of his fellow officers. His writing revealed growing suspicion about the handling of evidence in multiple cases, not just the warehouse raid that had initially caught his attention. One particularly disturbing document was a carbon copy of an evidence transfer form that bore forged signatures. Webb had apparently intercepted or copied the form before it was processed, then conducted his own verification of the purported transfer. His notes indicated that the receiving agency listed on the form had no record of accepting the transferred evidence, contradicting official departmental records. The implications were staggering. Webb had uncovered what appeared to be a systematic scheme to skim cash from drug raids, using falsified paperwork to cover the thefts. Multiple officers were implicated, including supervisors who would have been responsible for oversight and verification. The scheme had operated for years, potentially involving millions of dollars in stolen evidence. Morrison photographed every document before proceeding further. Experience had taught her that sensitive materials could disappear quickly once their existence became known within the department. She stored the originals in her personal safe and created multiple copies, distributing them to secure locations outside the police building. The next step required delicate navigation of departmental politics. Many of the officers named in Webb's documentation were either still active or had retired with full benefits and clean records. Opening an investigation would inevitably create waves that could reach the highest levels of command. Morrison needed to build a case quietly before revealing the scope of what Webb had uncovered. She began by cross-referencing Webb's allegations with official case files from the period. The warehouse raid documentation was still available in archived records, though it required special authorization to access files that old. Morrison's review confirmed many of Webb's observations about procedural irregularities and documentation gaps. The official evidence inventory listed the seized cash at exactly $4.2 million, but Webb's notes indicated he had observed significantly more money during the initial discovery. His rough count, conducted before official processing began, suggested the actual total was closer to $6.8 million, as the discrepancy represented approximately $2.6 million that had disappeared between discovery and documentation. Morrison traced the careers of officers identified in Webb's notes. Several had been promoted rapidly following the warehouse raid, advancing to positions that would have provided them with oversight authority over future operations. The pattern suggested a reward system for participants in the skimming scheme, with advancement serving as both incentive and insurance against future cooperation with investigators. One name that appeared repeatedly in Webb's documentation was Sergeant Thomas Kowalski, who had been present during the warehouse raid and had supervised evidence processing. Kowalski had retired in 1995 as a captain, receiving full benefits and departmental commendations for distinguished service. Webb's notes described him as the likely coordinator of the cash skimming operation. Morrison's investigation revealed that Kowalski had purchased a lakefront home in northern Michigan just 2 years after the warehouse raid, paying cash for a property valued at over $300,000. His official salary and benefits couldn't have supported such a purchase, yet no financial investigation had ever been conducted. The transaction had been completed through a shell company that dissolved shortly after the property transfer. Similar patterns emerged for other officers named in Webb's files. Expensive purchases, early retirements, and investments that exceeded their documented income were common themes. None had attracted attention at the time, because the purchases were spaced out over years and structured to avoid obvious detection. The federal connection Webb had pursued in the 1980s proved more difficult to trace. Agent Patricia Reeves had left the FBI years earlier, and the case files from that era were stored in deep archives that required extensive paperwork to access. Morrison submitted formal requests, but was warned that processing could take months due to the age of the records and classification concerns. While waiting for federal records, Morrison continued building her case through other means. She located retired officers who had worked peripherally with the narcotics division during the relevant period, conducting informal interviews under the guise of routine background checks for security clearances. Most were reluctant to discuss specific operations, but several confirmed the general atmosphere of corruption and misconduct that Webb had described. One retired detective, speaking confidentially, admitted that irregularities in evidence handling had been widely known but rarely discussed openly. Officers who raised questions were marginalized or transferred, creating an environment where misconduct could flourish unchecked. The warehouse raid had been particularly controversial within the division, though most officers had learned to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. Morrison's investigation faced a significant obstacle when she attempted to locate physical evidence from the warehouse raid. The official records indicated that seized materials had been transferred to federal custody, but her inquiries revealed no federal agency had any record of receiving Detroit PD evidence from that case. The money had simply vanished from the official chain of custody, leaving only paperwork to document its existence. The 3 suspects arrested during the raid presented another avenue for investigation. Morrison tracked down 2 of the 3 men, both of whom had maintained their innocence regarding the drug charges and had consistently claimed the amount of money seized was higher than officially reported. Their statements from 1980, reviewed in light of Webb's documentation, took on new credibility. One of the former suspects, now in his 70s and living in Georgia, agreed to speak with Morrison by phone. He described watching officers remove far more money from the warehouse than was ever officially acknowledged. His estimate of the total, approximately $6.5 million, aligned closely with Webb's unofficial count. The man had no reason to lie decades later, having long since served his time and moved on with his life. As Morrison's investigation progressed, she began to understand why Webb had felt compelled to maintain his secret files. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking, involving not just the theft of evidence but the systematic cover-up that followed. Supervisors had protected subordinates, federal agencies had been deceived, and the justice system had been manipulated to prevent exposure of the scheme. The pressure Webb had faced became evident through his increasingly frantic documentation style in later entries. His handwriting became less neat, his observations more paranoid, and his concerns about personal safety more pronounced. The final entries, dated just weeks before his death, suggested he believed his federal cooperation had been discovered and that retaliation was imminent. Morrison faced a decision point. She could quietly file her findings and recommend that the matter be referred to federal authorities for investigation. This approach would protect her career and avoid the political complications of pursuing decades-old corruption charges against retired officers. Alternatively, she could push for a full departmental investigation, knowing that such action would likely end her advancement opportunities and potentially put her safety at risk. The choice became clearer when Morrison discovered that several of the officers implicated in Webb's files had gone on to positions of authority in other law enforcement agencies. Thomas Kowalski, despite his retirement from Detroit PD, had worked as a security consultant for several federal contractors, gaining access to sensitive operations and classified information. His involvement in the warehouse raid theft raised questions about his suitability for such positions. Morrison made copies of Webb's complete file and began reaching out to federal agencies that might have jurisdiction over the case. The FBI's Detroit field office was the obvious starting point, but Morrison was concerned about potential conflicts of interest given the Bureau's previous involvement in the abandoned 1980s investigation. She eventually connected with a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Michigan who specialized in police corruption cases. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen, had built a reputation for pursuing difficult cases involving law enforcement misconduct. Chen agreed to review Morrison's materials confidentially before deciding whether federal prosecution was warranted. Chen's initial assessment was encouraging but cautious. Webb's documentation appeared authentic and detailed enough to support serious charges if corroborating evidence could be developed. However, the passage of time presented significant challenges. Many potential witnesses were deceased, physical evidence had been destroyed or lost, and statute of limitations issues might prevent prosecution of the original theft. The federal review process began with a comprehensive analysis of Webb's files. FBI forensic specialists examined the documents for authenticity, comparing paper types, ink composition, and printing methods with known samples from the relevant time period. The analysis confirmed that the materials were genuine artifacts from the 1980s, not modern fabrications. Handwriting analysis compared Webb's notes with samples from his official personnel file. The comparison confirmed that Webb had authored the documentation, lending credibility to his allegations. Computer analysis of the typewritten materials matched the fonts and formatting standards used by Detroit PD during the relevant period. Chen's team began the painstaking process of corroborating Webb's allegations through independent sources. Bank records, property transactions, and financial disclosures were subpoenaed for the officers identified in the files. The investigation required careful coordination with multiple agencies to avoid alerting targets who might still be in positions to obstruct justice. The financial analysis revealed patterns consistent with Webb's allegations. Several officers had made large cash purchases or investments shortly after major drug raids, with no documented source for the funds other than their police salaries. The timing and amount strongly suggested proceeds from evidence theft. Federal investigators also discovered that the warehouse raid was not an isolated incident. Webb's files referenced similar operations with comparable evidence discrepancies, suggesting the theft scheme had operated for years. The total amount of stolen evidence could have exceeded $10 million over the course of the conspiracy. As the federal investigation gained momentum, Morrison found herself under increasing scrutiny within the Detroit Police Department. Her inquiries about old case files had attracted attention, and several supervisors began questioning her activities. The pressure was subtle but persistent, designed to discourage further investigation without creating obvious retaliation. Morrison realized she was following the same path that had led to Webb's isolation and eventual death. The parallels were unsettling, particularly given that some of the same individuals who had been in positions of authority during Webb's time were still influential within the department. The institutional culture that had enabled the original corruption remained largely intact. The breakthrough came when federal investigators located Agent Patricia Reeves, the FBI agent who had worked with Webb in the 1980s. Reeves had retired to Arizona but maintained detailed personal files from her law enforcement career. Her records provided crucial corroboration for Webb's allegations and filled gaps in the official documentation. Reeves confirmed that Webb had been a credible source who provided detailed information about corruption within Detroit PD. Her investigation had been terminated not due to lack of evidence, but because of Webb's sudden death and institutional pressure to focus on other priorities. She had always suspected that Webb's death was not natural, but had lacked the authority to pursue the matter further. With Reeves's testimony and Webb's documentation, federal prosecutors had sufficient evidence to proceed with charges against surviving members of the conspiracy. The investigation expanded to include not just the warehouse raid, but the broader pattern of evidence theft that had operated for years within Detroit's narcotics division. The sealed box that had sat forgotten in a basement storage locker for over 2 decades had finally fulfilled Marcus Webb's desperate attempt to ensure the truth would eventually surface. His sacrifice had not been in vain, and justice, though delayed, was finally within reach.